Well, hey, everybody, welcome to session 2 of going through the book, The Language of God. A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. And we're covering our message series here at Hill-Tran Ministries titled The Language of God, Understanding Our Creator and Science. And with us is Jason VanHouten, who is a doctorate in education, who teaches science for a living. And we started off last week, session 1, and we talked about the introduction and really chapter 1 of the book, and just really got some backgrounds on Jason and his history and faith and science and education. But this week, we're just going to dive right in. If you missed last week, I just encourage you to go back and catch up with that. It'll help this session even further. Today, we're just talking about chapter 2, which is titled The War of Two Worlds, which is also the title of the message last week. This war that goes on in some circles between science and faith. Not necessarily in Collin's worlds, although it did in the beginning, as we discussed last week. But he was able to break free from that and finally settle into his faith, which he's only expanded on. That's why the motivation for writing this book. But he starts off with this first paragraph, and I just want to read his first paragraph. It says, if you started this book as a skeptic and have managed to travel this far with me, no doubt a torrent of your own objections has begun to form. I certainly have my own. And so here's 3 questions that he raises. So we'll start with these 3 questions. It says, isn't God just a case of wishful thinking? Hasn't a great deal of harm been done in the name of religion? And how could a loving God permit suffering? And how can a serious scientist accept the possibilities of miracles? So these are really the 4 questions that he's going to argue for and lift up in this chapter. And so we'll hammer some of those and talk about that. But I just want to start with that first question. Isn't God just a case of wishful thinking? And I've heard that argument many times in my life. Will continue to hear it, mainly from thinkers, people that are highly intellect, people that think. Everything's a process. They got to think things through. They're just deep thinkers. Got to research, got to ask a lot of questions. And nothing wrong with those people. We need those people. But sometimes they can be too smart for their own good. But anyway, we have those people. So is that the case? That's a question I've had to wrestle with in my faith. Is this just a fairy tale? Is this just an allegory of stories? Is it just wishful thinking? We're just wishing upon a star that there's this Heavenly Father to help make sense of all this stuff, and that when we die, that we'll see everybody we love again. That's kingdom people, and we'll live forever in eternity with God and those who went before us. Is that just wishful thinking? So what do you think about that, Jason? What do you think in your circles as a scientist and talking science and having conversations with a lot of people? I mean, what do you think? Is this just all a bunch of wishful thinking?
I hope not. It comes down to it. I'm under the impression that it's not just wishful thinking. I can understand why people, like you're saying, that think about things. They have trouble discerning between the different myths of ancient Greek and Norse mythology, and then they just want to lump it all together with Christianity. I'm a Christian. I don't think it's just wishful thinking. But there's not much you can also say, unfortunately, to those people that doesn't make you just sound like exactly what they're wanting to pin you in on. They're always thinking, well, obviously this person is just grasping at straws. Like you said, it's just wishful thinking. It's very hard to if you're already in that mindset, it's hard to get them out of that mindset. So I don't think it's wishful thinking. I don't really have too many debates on that, because once they found out that I'm a Christian, most of the people just go, oh, and then just go along like that. I have never been pressed too hard. Well, they'll say, well, you're wrong. I'm a large guy. Maybe that has to do with it too. They don't want to tick me off. I don't know. But I can honestly say that no one has pressed me on it, but I'm hoping it ain't wishful thinking. I've got too much invested in my life and in my heart for it to be wishful thinking.
Right. Well, and I concur with that. I mean, I have a lot of reasons why I have total confidence that it's not wishful thinking, and it's just because I've studied the person of Jesus, and there's a ton of I can go on and on about the argument for Jesus. If there's a good book, if you've never read it, and this is to anybody listening, and it's one that I would add to your library. It's a little bit deep because it really dives into the theological background and the biblical background on arguments for Jesus and the Gospels, why we can take him at face, that we can subscribe to him as truth and build that into our faith. And it's called The Jesus Legend. And it's written by Dr. Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy. And it's a great book. It's called The Jesus Legend. And they put together all the different theories. Are they myths? Are they legends? Are they hallucinations? I mean, they do all that very well. And they spend a lot of time putting this book together. And I think if you spend some time in that book, it'll really help your faith journey and have confidence in why you would believe in a Jesus-looking God. I think there's a lot of questions that can definitely rattle some people's cages, and this is what this book's about. And the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, of the Bible, did those really happen? Is that allegories? Is it strictly stories? I mean, there's Jewish tradition out there that there's a lot of, especially Reform Judaism, that doesn't believe that even Moses was a real person, that this was just a story to describe who God was and how God was, to describe his character and what he expects from the people in the world. And so you have all kinds of stories out there that frame around this. If you do the research and study that, you can see how this gets out into circles. And if you're highly intelligent, you look at yourself as the highest form of being. I'm the highest form of intelligence. And so therefore, it's got to be able to be figured out. If it's not figured out today, somebody will figure it out tomorrow. And so you hang on to that, and that becomes your faith. This becomes your journey. And it's a very sad place to live, because at the end of the day, there's what meaning is there for life? If this is all chance, and it's all about survival of the fittest and natural selection, then why do we have this moral law that I don't think anybody can really argue that goes on inside human beings? How do we know it's wrong to take someone else's life? How do we know it's wrong to steal from somebody? How do we know it's wrong to speak ill of somebody? And why do most people categorize that? If you took their wallet, they would call you a thief. So there's a barometer of good and bad in each and every one of us. How come that is? And those are the mystery questions that we looked up in number 1 that really play into this. But I think in the big scheme of things, in your faith journey, these are things you need to think about. And don't be afraid to ask hard questions, and don't be afraid to read some books. And Google can be your enemy as much as it can be your friend. So you have to be careful on what resources you pour off the internet, because you can get all kinds of stuff. But if you get good scholarly pieces of writing, whether it's science or theology, then I would say invest some time in that, because these people have really put forth the effort. It's just somebody's, pull something out of the sky and put it, and they're articulate enough to make it sound, put a spin on it and dazzle you with their literary skills. But I mean, these people actually done the research. They're gonna reference all that. And the nice thing about those references and going through those bibliographies is that you can find other resources to read that may intrigue you even more. So there's an endless path of research and material to study both science and theology out there. And I would encourage people to do that. And come to your own conclusions about these things. But that's what I had to do. That's why I have a lot of confidence. I'm not certain of a lot of things about the faith journey. I'm not, certain how old the earth is, as we talked about last week, but I don't care, either today. I don't care if you're a literalist or a non-literalist when it comes to, this is the Bible as a whole. What I do care about is that, do you understand who Jesus is? Why the cross is important, why the resurrection is important, and what the calling, if you're going to follow Jesus, what that means for your life, and helping you live into that as a disciple. And so those are what comes out of it for me. But that wishful thinking, I don't hang on anymore, because of what's happened in my life, what I've seen transform my heart. is the real evidence for me, and what I've seen happen for countless other people that were broken beyond human aid. There was no human aid going to help these people. It had to come from God, had to come from a power greater than them. And I've watched it happen time after time and be an eyewitness to it. And so all those journeys, help enhance my faith. So I would argue all day that it's not wishful thinking, but I can't prove it either.
Right. Like I said, it's hard to prove a negative. That's something, it's hard to prove them wrong if all they're saying is show me.
Well, exactly. But then at the same time, they can't, if they want to argue for a Big Bang theory,
right?
Who pulled the trigger? How did it all get started? So I mean, you can ask those questions, and some of them are rhetorical in nature, but you can ask questions and you can beat the thing to death. And somewhere along the line, your faith's going to come in. Either you're going to have faith in science, or you're going to have faith in God, or you're going to say they both agree. In colleges, you're going to argue that they both agree with each other. They're pointing to the same thing. I would subscribe to that same worldview. I would totally subscribe to it. Not always. There was a time when I was very heavy into the literal side of faith, and I would have pushed against science all day long. Oh, that's focus. And they're just trying to, some secular stuff. They're trying to pull out this guy, some liberal agenda, trying to twist your mind. I would have been there. I had that experience. And I know a lot of people that have. And then, he goes on and quotes some pretty great theologians. Paul Tillich, he quotes here, and he says, doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it is an element of it. And so doubt comes into all this stuff. I don't know how, when you talk about all the hypotheses and all the theories, how most of them never work out to be anything in science, at least that's what Collin says, that it leads to a lot of doubt. You put all this faith and energy and time and effort into something, and at the end of the day, it just ends up being nothing or a failed experiment. But doubt creates this. And so when you ask questions, it creates doubt. But I think that's how your faith grows, because your faith, you got to be able to wrestle with the hard questions, which unfortunately most believers haven't. They have them, but they just avoid the questions because it's too uncomfortable. They don't know how to respond. They haven't done the time. They haven't studied. They haven't did the research to be able to have a conversation about it. So they just avoid the conversation. And I don't think that's a healthy place to be either. I think it's totally acceptable to bring your doubts out of their hiding places and say, I have doubts about some of this stuff. Truly have doubts. And Billy Graham himself shared many times that he had doubts in his faith. A lot of big, heavy hitters in theology have all shared their doubts. We all have them. Every person has them. So science or theology alike, I think we can see where those come into play. And so this idea isn't the idea of God wishful fulfillment. It was what he lifts up big time in one of these questions. And he talks about a materialist worldview into an indescribable spiritual dimension, and an experience that he found quite astonishing. And he goes on to talk about, again, the moral law in the preceding chapter, and how it lies beyond the signpost placed deep within the human spirit, pointing towards something more grander than ourselves. And this is something I think he bumps up against all the time when in his own experience, strength and hope, as he's done research and he's done a lot of incredible things. But every time when he gets, even once he discovers something or they make a breakthrough, in whatever they're working on, whatever research they're doing, it's still at the end of the day, they're not completely satisfied with it because it points to something greater. It always points to a power greater than themselves. I mean, you're a scientist, you do lots of experiments with kids all year long. I mean, what does that look like from your perspective?
There's always, whenever you're doing things with the kids, especially, there's always this wondering of why it works, of how it works. It's more likely of how. More than likely, they're asking how something works. The stuff that we're trying to get together is showing how this machine helps with this do this amount of work so that you don't have as much force. But most of the time, there's still something that they'll come up with, and they'll say, "But why? But why is it put together like that?" And being in a public school setting, I can't just go, "Well, God's put it that way." I just can't do that. And not to mention, that's a bit of a cop out anyway.
Yeah.
I might not know what it is, but I know that it definitely happens for a reason, and I do think that happens because that's the way it was put together. Not like you said, somebody had to pull the trigger on a Big Bang,
Yeah.
and so
Right.
and
Yeah.
so it's just not one of the things that you can explain away very easily. And every once in a while, you just got to accept that you don't know it all, that there's no way you're ever going to know it all, and that there is something, someone who put that all together for you.
Yeah. I mean, and some of these brilliant minds, they looked up Sigmund Freud and writing out of this Total Man Taboo when he lays out psychoanalysis for the first time and really brings it out into the scientific world, which made headways in the field of medicine and dealing with all kinds of mental health issues in people's lives, and psychoanalysis is still used today. Trying to make sense of why we do the things we do. And his argument was that he would argue that most of we're shaped, even sexually, our sexual preference and sexual life was shaped by the time we're 7, and that our relationship with our earthly father will have a great deal of influence on what we think of this heavenly father, and that that this whole idea of God is just an exalted father, that in his worldview, and I would go all the way along with it, except to that's the finality of it. It's just an exalted person. I think it's how we experience God has a lot to do with our earthly fathers. I didn't have one. I mean, my dad was never really around. Only saw him a handful of times, and he had already left this earth a couple of years before I ever knew that he had passed away. I mean, that's how fractured our relationship was. So, did that have an influence on my faith journey? You bet. Yeah, it definitely did. But it wasn't the final destination, and I don't believe in God just because I had a poor earthly father experience. Because I know plenty of people that have had amazing father experiences and are strong believers. So I mean, I just think it's easy to self-defeat that argument. But science gives us some foundation sometimes to think about some of these things. But I just don't subscribe that it's just wishful thinking. It's just like a tooth fairy or Santa Claus category that we put God into, and it just helps us sleep better at night. With this invisible friend that we're dragging around. Linus and his blanket, the Easter Bunny, and all these things that these myths they get started in life, and those do though. I mean, you think about, especially as a child, there you put a lot of faith and hope and wonder into things like Santa Claus and Easter Bunny and Halloween and some of these other, if you want to call holidays that we center some of these fictitious characters around that we spend years of our life believing in, only to find out that it was not true. Well, it is, but it isn't. There is a Santa Claus. His name's Dad and Mom. What I'm saying, but it's not a real. Yeah, exactly. But it's not a real person, and so that's kind of where a lot of these people, I think, in science take that God and they just put him in that same category as a myth, as a legend, and it's not real, but it's kind of like Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster. It's just a legend out there that we hang on to.
And that also probably kind of, in their own eyes, releases them of some of the responsibilities that believing in God brings about. You have to, if there is, in their eyes, if there is a God, they have somebody that they have to atone to. Mm-hmm. They have a moral standard to which they need to live up to. If there is, if Jesus led a sinless life and he's who we need to emulate ourselves after, then we have more of a chance to fail. If, however, there is no God, there was no Jesus, then I'm good. I don't have to worry about all that. It's a cop out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, great point. And it really is. And again, if I have doubts about it, and I mean doubts to the side of them, whether there is a God, and I've been denouncing it all this time, and I've argued for it, against it all this time, it creates a tremendous amount of pain. The humility just to say, what if I'm wrong? What if there is this power out there? Then it would be a revelation. It's kind of like the road to Damascus, Paul meeting Jesus, and changing his life. But at the end of the day, I love how he concludes this chapter. He says, what is the difference between a cathedral and a physics lab? Are they not both saying hello? And I think they are. I mean, I would have never been able to articulate it that way, until some years back. But that's really, again, I just call it God's fingerprints are everywhere. Whether it's under a microscope or just with what you can see with your eyes. If you just look hard enough, you can say, there's so much mystery. How can that not be from a power, a supernatural entity, a creator?
Yeah, they're both just trying to figure out the secrets, what happened and why we're here. They're both trying to figure out, just using different ways to do it.
Yeah, but if the whole concept is what Jesus tells us, that it's all about faith, right. You're not meant to figure it out. You're not supposed to figure it out. That's where the faith comes in. You have say-so, you have free will. You can choose to believe or not to believe. But at the end of the day, it isn't for you to have all the answers. What does he tell Doubting Thomas? Poor you have to wait and see me. You have to touch my wounds and feel my side before you can believe. But blessed is the person who can believe without seeing. And that's tremendous faith to be able to live into that. Not only, intellectually believe it, but actually live into it. I mean, be sold out for it. And that's a huge shift. But I believe at all points. I mean, I just think if you look, if you seek, you shall find, as the old saying goes, that you will find the mystery. And that's what I think Dr. Collins lifts up here in a lot of different ways, is saying simply that if you honestly seek, there's an old passage in recovery literature that says this: God does not make too hard of terms for those who honestly seek him. And I think but the key word there is honest. Am I honestly seeking? And if I do, it's like a spiritual game of hide and seek. It just all of a sudden things start to come together. All of a sudden something that didn't there yesterday, all of a sudden it's here today. An answer I didn't have, an inspiration I didn't have, a motivation I didn't have. And so it's a beautiful thing, this faith journey. But I don't think we're supposed to figure it all out. We can try, and it's exciting, but we're not supposed to. We're supposed to just have faith in what Jesus said is truth. And doesn't mean we don't learn, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to faith. And we're so quick to say we believe. We just, and there's a lot of words like the word miracle, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but there's just a lot of words that we water down that come right out of the Bible. Words like love, belief, miracles, and we water them and use them in such a nonchalant way that they lose their real meaning. We kind of zap them for what they are. A great example, back in the 1800s, there was a famous trapeze artist named Charles Blondin. They called him the Great Blondie. He's from France. And he used to come to the Niagara Falls all the time, and he would walk tightrope across the falls. And he did it time and time again. And he would do it a variety of different ways. One time he went across in a gunny sack. Another time he took a grill with him and actually made an omelet as he walked across the falls, on a tightrope. And then he brought his wife, who was a trapeze artist, and she was a very petite lady. I think if my researchers remember, she's like 4'5", just small, probably didn't weigh 100 pounds. He brought a little single small wheelbarrow with him, and he pushed that across the falls. And then on one of his ways back, he put her in it, and he pushed her across the falls. And then he got to the other side, he looked at the crowd and says, "Do you believe I can do it again?" And of course, everybody's screaming, of course you can do it again. You're the great blondie. He says, do you really believe it? Yeah. Somebody come and get in the wheelbarrow. And history says that out of thousands of people, he extended that invitation. Not one person ever got in the wheelbarrow. Nobody would. They all said they believed it. But when it come down to put your money where your mouth is, they couldn't get in there. And so I think, that's what we do sometimes, I think, is that we throw words around loosely. And then we wonder why they don't have staying power. They don't really, have a good adhesive in our lives when trials and low spots hit us. And so again, I think the more you wrestle with this stuff, the stronger your faith gets. I think it's important to wrestle. And all the Old Testament prophets wrestled with God. All of them did. They all wrestled with God. And God welcomed it. He enjoyed it. Somehow or another, we got this idea that you can't say no to God and you can't push back against God. You can't ask God tough questions. You can't yell at God. I don't see that anywhere. I think God welcomes it. Just like you would welcome a child wanting to debate some truth principle that you're trying to share with them. You want them to ask the question, why is it like that? Why does it have to be that way? And it doesn't seem fair, and you want them to push back and ask questions. You wouldn't want to just take it at face value. And so it's interesting. The next question he kicks around, he says, what about the harm done in the name of religion? Have you had any experiences where in your family history or you personally where you've been hurt by the church or hurt by clergy or hurt by faith traditions in any way?
Oh, when I was growing up, in many of the formative years, and I think one of the reasons why I didn't come to the church as early as I did was during the scandals, the televangelists, Jim Baker and that sort of thing. And that kind of turned me off for a while. I'm not going to lie. And then every time you see fanciness, and Ray Stevens has an awesome song with Jesus Wears Rolex on his television show. When you have a fancy car, you got to think about things like that a lot of times because that became so prevalent where these super preachers, these huge congregations, they had all this money and to the point where they fell because of it. And they ended up being in a worse place than they were before they became famous. That probably was the biggest thing that I had to wrestle with when it came to it. And still to this day, whenever I see one of those TV shows, and Joel Osteen is awesome, but still in the back of my head every now and then is Jim Baker, and that whole scandal and Jimmy Swaggart when he had his issues back in I think it was the 80s, the late 80s, sure. When he had the issue going on. So yeah, I've had some issues with that you wrestle with all the time.
Good. I mean, so that's fair. And those are fair things to bring out of the dark. So a lot of people won't talk about that stuff because they don't want to look bad on. But I think that's fair. I think it's fair to bring out the pedophilia in the Catholic Church and evangelistic churches, the abuse, the clergy abuse that's happened to many, many people. And this has always went on. That's what Jesus scolded the Pharisees and the Sadducees about because they were so legalistic. It's the story of the widow, and they're standing there in their bright robes and their shiny stuff. And then here's this woman bringing everything that she's got and giving it to the church. And she's starving. Mm-hmm. I don't even know where she's going to get her next meal, but yet she's giving everything she's got. They're standing there all high and mighty with their sandals and their long robes. And Jesus detests all this stuff. He's like, he detests it because it's all about the heart. And it's, you're proud. And the Bible says nothing angers the Lord more than somebody who's proud, And so, but yeah, I had all those same conflicts. There used to be a joke that my dad was from Oklahoma, where Oral Roberts was at, and there used to be a joke that there was a statue out there like this, out in front of the university there, and if you put a quarter in it, it would go like that. That was a little joke. And but if you go back into old church history, Jason, and you go back when you look at what the Catholic Church did, and that was the church back in the day, and what some of these clergy people did to people, and this is how this whole concept of purgatory really took off, and especially people of wealth. Oh, you got this sin? Well, if you give this amount of money to the church, then we'll get that forgiven. We'll pay that sin off. You can buy yourself out of it. You can buy yourself out of purgatory. You want to be in purgatory long, you won't have to go to hell. And the church got very rich off of that. A lot of the big buildings built back then came off of those kind of concessions for people. And so there's just a history of what power does to people. And whether it's in the cloth or in politics or in business, it doesn't matter. Power is, as Lord Acton would say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And even though you may, the church is very powerful. It's not as powerful as it used to be, but the church is powerful. Has a lot of say so in circles. And with that comes a lot of you sell yourself, basically. You sell your soul sometimes to remain popular and not get friction from the secular world, still have power, still have rights. And so it gets compromised. And when it gets uncovered, it's ugly. So whether it's sex, whether it's theft, whether it's power, whether it's glory, whether it's prestige, the things you're talking about, you got a preacher on there telling you how you need to give all you got, while they're going to drive away in their BMW and fly home in their jet. I mean, that's a total compromise to the kingdom life anyway. And so I just think people that interpret scripture that way and live that way, they're going to have to face Jesus like we're all going to have to face Jesus. And what will come of that, I don't know. I know what the kingdom life says. And so for all that, so he makes a great point. He says you can look at all that and you can push at it, and skeptics do, the Crusaders and all the people that were killed in the name of God. And Islam has that same blemish with 9/11 and ISIS and these radical rogue sects of Islam. But the overall Islam is not that way. It's not what their text says. It's just some twisted version of it. And it's the same way that happened with scripture, that God is on our side. It's taking that colonist language, and pulling it into the worldview, that God is on our side. This is God's will. God is for us. We'll take them out. Just like, stories in the Old Testament, God on their side, they'll take the land. And people leverage that. They used it for slavery, in an ugly way. And the Methodist Church split numerous times over the years because of different interpretations. And I mean, especially Southern Methodists had their own catechism for slaves. I mean, you think about that. You had people in the North going totally against slavery, and then you had people that claimed it from the same sect, denomination, and affiliation, and so-called beliefs and creeds and everything else. And yet they subscribed to the idea that having a slave was a good idea, that it was from God. And so there's just been a lot of ugly, nasty stuff that's taken place in the church, no question about it. So if you're listening to this, you've been hurt by the church, I just hope you can get with a good person that can help you walk and unpack that. But all that said, and all that stuff's true, and I don't argue. I think the church has a big apology to make. And I'm saying church, I mean the big C church, just the church as a whole has a big apology to make. But there's so much of it that continues on that you can't make an amends for something that you're still doing, and so unfortunately it's out there. But all that said, and Collins points this out, which I appreciate, there's been a heck of a lot of good things that came out of the church, and more than there is bad. I mean, no question about it. It's not even close. It's easy to look at the ugly, but I mean, there's so much good and so much awesome stuff. And there's so many things that happen in the world with people being fed and clothed and housed and taken care of that would never happen to people that paid for it in those corners. So, but yeah, it's a tough question. It really is. But again, if you're listening, you've been hurt by the church, you've been hurt by clergy. Anyway, I mean, get some help and bring that out of the dark and talk about it. And as he would argue, there's a lot of people that are atheists or agnostic for that very reason. And it's hard, if you've really done the research, which a lot of these people have, it's hard to push back against that. And you could understand, at least that's what I would say. I could understand why you would struggle with God, the concept of God, with some of that stuff, especially if you've been abused in your own right. A preacher's kid, hypocritical parents. They do one thing on Sunday, but they live another way Monday through Saturday. You know, the stories go on and on and on. So I mean, so you have to have love, compassion, and a lot of grace for people that are coming to you saying, you know, I got beat up by the church. And it's sad, you know, it truly is sad if that's happened. So we just got to do our part, Jason, as kingdom people, not to let that happen to people, you know, and that's the goal. This next question, Brad, you had something?
No, I was just going to agree with you.
Okay. This next question, why would a loving God allow suffering in the world? So what do you think about that question, Jason? Why would a loving God do this? I mean, this is an argument that the skeptics put forth.
Right. Well, you go back to the whole portion about free will. You know, that it goes along with everything. You don't want automatons that just follow you because everything's going to be great and everything's going to be rosy. And it also takes away your to me, it takes away your responsibility as well to be kind to others. Because if you know God's going to take care of them, you don't have to be kind to them yourself. So, I mean, the whole thing about things happening and bad things happening, there really shouldn't be with a kind and loving God. Just don't buy it. You know, it's very easy to cop out with that. And again, I've thought about that as well. You know, after 9/11, I was like, where can it be? Where's the God that would be able to stop them right then from crashing those planes in there? Why didn't he stop it? So it's to me, it has a lot to do again with the free will of being good to your neighbor, treating your neighbor like you want to be treated yourself.
Yeah. So I agree. I think if you understand free will for what it is, that you have say so, is what I like to say. You have say so in what you're going to do, and you know, as much as we want to say God is omnipresent, that He's omnipotent, that He's omniscient, knows everything before it ever happens, I don't know that that's necessarily the case because of the element of free will. I know God ultimately has a plan and knows how humanity will ultimately go. I totally believe that. And regardless of what choice we make, He has a counter choice, a counter attack for that. But in the moment, I don't know. I think there's a lot of openness to what can happen next in our lives and what will happen. Will the guy really fly the plane into the building? Will this person fly the plane into the Pentagon? You know, will this person really shoot this person? Will this person really go through with this? And we have say so, and so we may not. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we may or may not. And so, but either way, whether we do or we don't, God's there and God's got a response. Romans 8:28 tells us that. So I just tell people all the time, I said, you know, when you ask why is there so much evil in the world, why do I have to suffer? You know, why do hurricanes happen? And why didn't God intervene in the tornadoes and tsunamis and all this stuff? Why? And before I think you can ask all those questions, you got to ask that why did Jesus have to die? A person who never committed any sin, God's only son. Why did He have to? You know, I think you need to lean into that question. And I think you start to get a little bit of an answer to the suffering in the world, that it's a fallen world. And the fallen angelic beings, as the Bible would lay out, had say so, just like you and I have say so. And they had this temptation for power, glory, and prestige. They wanted to be like God. And so the Bible tells us that 2/3 of the angels fell, you know, because of that desire to be God for themselves, to be the God of their own life, to be in charge of their own life. They wanted to know what God knew, and they wanted to be as powerful as God. And you just can't have it. Can't happen. And so they fell. And that fallen world, it's not just angelic beings, but it's human beings. It's all creation is fallen. And so God, if you unpack the story, time after story after story, God's trying to reconcile that. And again, if you have an openness mind, you can see where he tries it and sees what's going to happen, and then the people fail to do it. So then he gives them another chance, and then they do it again, and the story just goes on and on and on. Ultimately, it comes to the point.
Another chance.
Right. And ultimately, it comes to the point that there's only one person that can solve the problem, and that's the one who created it, if you want to point there, and that's God, because he gave humanity free will. He gave us, we were born in his image, and he gave us free will. He gave us say-so. And there's major risk involved with that. And so that risk is we can do evil, and we do evil. And so God says, I'll send my only son into the world. And the ugly humanity did what they do to everybody else. And they tried to kill God. And that's what they thought they were doing. Only to have him rise 3 days later and claim victory over death once and for all. But with a promise that one day all this fallenness is going to go away and that we're going to be restored. And nobody knows when that's going to happen. Nobody knows the day or the hour, but that's all going to be redeemed. And as kingdom people living now, suffering is terrible. And we have friends of ours, mutual friends right now, you and I, that are suffering right now, that are going to lose their life in the weeks ahead here. And it's a sad part of life. It's the story of the fall. And there's nothing that says you and I won't die horrific deaths. I mean, we could easily do that tomorrow, but that doesn't waver my faith. I just realize it's part of the fall, and suffering goes with it. But with our suffering, we can count it all joy, as James would say, that we have God in our life. And even the worst that they can do is destroy my body, but they can't take my soul, which is my mind, my will, and my emotions. And that can't be taken from me. You can take me physically out, cancer or homicide or an accident, however it would happen, but you can't destroy my soul, because Jesus died for that. And this body will be restored. And that's a beautiful thing. But it's a fair question. It really is a fair question. And if you're trying to make it, especially if you have God in this box, that he's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's omnipresent, omniscient, that if he knows everything, he's all powered, he's everything, why does this happen? It's a fair question. It's a question I've had. And, but then I had to start looking at the cross and realize that he made the ultimate sacrifice. Right. And I can never lose sight of that. So it's a tough question, but it's out there. So this last question that he kicks around gets into the idea of miracles. And he gets some mathematical questions around this idea of miracles. And I think it's interesting. But the question is, how can a rational person believe in miracles? Now, this is where, I think your scientific mind can really challenge you, because of all the advances in society. You pick a category that have been made because of science. Mm-hmm. So the idea, if you Google AT&T commercials from 1993, for example, it's a great commercial to look at. They say they got like people on the beach. It's in 1993, and they got people on the beach. It says, "Will one day will we be able to look at each other on the screen, and talk to each other face to face on a screen?" Yes. And who's going to bring you that technology? We will. And that was 15 years before it ever happened. But the idea that it was possible was there, and that's what drove people, and so they show that, and they have some great commercials from back in the early 90s of projecting this stuff. And so with that, it's like there's got to be a scientific answer for a miracle. And so he goes through this theorem, and he talks about this idea of prior, and this prior, I guess, and I would say it's like synonymous with evidence, of common sense evidence. So maybe a little bit deeper in common sense, but the prior's got to be very low, that there's just really no chance this could ever really happen for it to be a miracle. I mean, it has to be really, really, really low, and so he gives these calculations in the chapter that are just crazy numbers. And he's got this one, he says, being mathematically inclined, you can calculate the chances of a good fortune as 1 in 52 times 1 in 52 equals 1 in 2704. A very unlikely event. But it happened. And he's talking about this card game. And so he's talking about that. Even though the odds are so far out there, it's still possible. So you can go out and buy a Mega Millions ticket, and you can win. They tell you the odds, so you get struck by lightning 3 times before you ever do that. But the odds are out there. So that the odds exist at all, is it really a miracle? And that's where skeptics say, if we can figure it out, if we can make, we can calculate it out, we can run the numbers, even though it's an astronomical number. If it's the realm of possibility, then they would try to argue that it's not a miracle. How can you believe in that when we can figure out that it could happen? Mathematically, it could happen. It doesn't happen very often, but it could happen. So therefore, they want to dismiss it as a miracle. So what do you think about that? I mean, from a science mindset, I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, Collins also talks about the prevalence of somebody who gets well after they weren't supposed to as being a medical miracle. I'd kind of look at it as being almost a predetermined miracle. I mean, we were put together in a way that the chemical reactions that take place in our bodies that keep us alive have to be certain precise measurements as it goes. But with our knowledge that we have now, somebody could be very sick and they say they are going to die, and they can get better. It's not necessarily is it a miracle at that one particular moment. I think it's the overall miracle that we have been fashioned the way we have, that there's a power in us. Well, not really power, that's not the right term. There's more of a ability within us that where these chemical reactions and all of these things can actually right themselves, where the doctors can't see, the scientists can't see it. And if we can't see it, it's automatically a miracle. But that the ability is in there. Like I said, it's a predetermined miracle. It's something that has the ability to happen, and when it does, and we can't explain why it happens, all of a sudden we're just mystified. So the miracle is there. It's just not only in that particular instance. It's built on the many miracles that has come and that has made us the way we are, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, and again, back when I lifted up earlier with Collins and stuff, is that we water down these words to take the real value. I mean, we even have miracle whip, saying, the greatest, you got the miracle, the hockey team beating Russia. I mean, it's a miracle on ice. I mean, we have, and so the probabilities of that, though, are probably, if you calculate them out, probably aren't that really that extreme. They're out there, and if you did it 100 times, they may only do it once out of 100, but they're probably not that far out there like they were in this card trick. But yeah, we throw that word around very loosely, and I'm guilty of it, in myself. It's just part of how you grew up. It just gets into your vocabulary and you use it. But I've known, it's like in my life where I came from, the darkness that I was trapped in, and to where I'm at today. It's easy for people when they hear my testimony go, Harold, you're just a walking miracle. But I'm really not the miracle. I have a miraculous life because I tapped into the miracle, which is Jesus Christ. It's our faith. It's this God, this essence of who God is. And when I can tap into that, and not just tap into it, but live into it, then the impossible becomes possible. And that's what's beautiful about it. It's where you go from worldly mathematics, as we're lifting up here, to spiritual mathematics, where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore. And the walls come down when God's got work for you to do. The seas get parted. the walls come crumbling down, there's many of those stories in the Bible, but all those things are characterized by faith. The people had to participate in the miracle. God will move mountains for you, but he's going to ask you to bring a shovel. How many times did Jesus say, your faith has healed you? Because of the extreme measures these people went to touch Jesus, be by Jesus, hear Jesus, for Jesus to touch him. They went through a lot of torture and abuse from people in the streets. Get back. What are you doing? Get away from her. Even the disciples themselves tried to keep people from Jesus. But when they went to the extreme, whether they're a centurion or they were a guard, whoever they were, when they came with that kind of faith, Jesus always answered. So, you want a miracle in your life, you're going to have to most likely participate in it. And I think that's fair. I think the Bible really shows us that you want a miracle to happen in your church, then your church is going to have to get busy and be a part of the miracle. But I think we put God in this category as the rainmaker, bring down manna from heaven, instead of, because I think what kingdom people miss sight of as part of this miraculous effort that I'm talking about is that we are Jesus. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. And that's why Jesus came, to help us live into that. And so should God rain down manna from heaven and what he did for the Exodus people, and when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, they had manna, which had a light honey taste to it, and they had meat. So they had meat at night and they had manna every day. They ate the same thing for 40 years. But God provided that. God promised, I will make sure they're out here in the desert. There's nowhere to get anything. I will provide these things. Predicated on you do this, and I need you to do this. And so it's the same thing with us as kingdom people. We keep saying, solve world hunger, solve the homelessness, solve, this political divide, solve this social unrest, solve it, God. God says, I got you. You are the solution. Live into that. Wake up to that truth. That's why you're here. That's why Jesus came. That's why we sent the Holy Spirit. So you can do greater things. Jesus said, I'm going to go. So he will come in. Through him, you will do greater things than I ever did. And we have to live into that as kingdom people, to be part of the miraculous process. That's our job. And most people miss it. All they do is pray, God, will you do this? Will you feed these people? Will you clothe these people? Will you give them some warmth tonight? And God's like, dude, I'm asking you to do it. Go do it. And so when we start living into that, is when miraculous things happen on a more regular basis. So we have to participate in the miracle. He ends with this as he segues into the next chapter. He said, and so making this final argument for skeptics, which I totally get. He says this, despite these arguments, materialistic skeptics who wish to give no ground to the concept of the supernatural, those who refute the evidence from the moral law and the universe sense of longing for God, will no doubt argue that there is no need to consider miracles at all. In their view, the laws of nature can explain everything, even the exceedingly impossible. And so some of those thinkers in your circles. But he concludes with this paragraph, and I love it, and he sets us up for the next stage. But can this view be completely sustained? Can you keep this up? Can you keep hanging on to that idea? There's at least one singular, exceedingly improbable, and profound event in history that scientists of nearly all disciplines agree is not understood and will never be understood, and for which the laws of nature fall completely short of providing an explanation. Would that be a miracle? Read on. That's just how he ends that chapter. And so we will carry on with what he's talking about in our next session together. So some hard questions, hard topics to talk about. Is this all wishful thinking? Is how can we believe in God with all the damage that's been done in the name of God, throughout life? Is there such things as miracles, in the world? I mean, all these arguments that we lifted up today are fair. And so, friends, if you have these questions, if you have wrestled with this stuff, I'm telling you, bring it out of the dark and let's talk about it. And And we don't have to have all the answers, but at least we're talking about it. And do some research, read some books, and ask tough questions, and listen to podcasts. There's lots of great thinkers out there to think about. And I wouldn't get lost in the political side. Well, they're right, they're left, they're conservative, they're liberal. If they're true thinkers, and they're honest thinkers, and they've come to conclusions in an honest way, whether you agree with it or not, from a political perspective or literal or a non-literal way, they're still worth listening to, and you can still learn from them, and they can still enhance your faith. They may make you believe or help you believe stronger than you've ever believed before for why you believe what you believe, and they may push you, and I'm always open to that. If somebody could come by and give me evidence against Jesus, that Jesus is not true, and I mean it's concrete, I might be swayed by it, but ain't nobody done it in 2,000 plus years. And I don't see it happening anytime soon. So I'm pretty confident where I sit. But I would encourage you as we close out today, check out that book, The Jesus Legend by Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd. It's a great read. It'll help you with your why you should believe in Jesus. I guarantee it will. So Jason, thank you for joining us today as always. And now this book and our conversations are going to get heavy on you. As
great.
we move forward, because we're going to get into all your language. I mean, next week we're talking Big Bang and the universe and all this stuff. This is all your forte. And so I'm going to be anxious to hear what I can learn from you as we go along, and what others can learn from you as we do it. So thank you. God bless you and your family and friends. We'll see you next week for session 3. So until then, you notice I got my Chiefs shirt on. I'm optimistic. The odds are in our favor that we'll win the Super Bowl tomorrow, Sunday. And I'm pretty excited. I'm so excited. I'm already wearing my jersey. And so go Chiefs.